Welcome to Collector's Corner, the premier digital art platform.
We help collectors gain and maintain their edge, all while appreciating beautiful art.
Let's jump in.
All right, Jared is here. It is noon Eastern. Jared just sent you the co-host invite. And
What up? Hello, everybody.
How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Living the dream as always. Super amped for this one. Honestly, I actually just did a podcast yesterday with Depeche Mode, and this was one of the projects he brought up. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm around it. Super excited to dig in and hear more from MV and really the community. This is going to be exciting.
Absolutely. And MV, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah, I'm excited to speak to you both, and nice to meet you, Jared. We haven't met before, so yeah, thank you. That's really nice to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And for folks who don't know, MV, in addition to being an amazing artist, has a very charming British accent. I was telling him this is going to go over fantastically on Spaces. So that's more Easter eggs coming out here.
I'm actually married to an American, so it's funny. It sort of warps between slightly Americanized English and British English. So I'll try and stick to the British for you, P.
Awesome. Yeah, we'll keep it British. I'll handle the American side, me and Jared. So thanks everybody for coming. Wanted to shout out a few folks in the crowd, a few friends. Really appreciate you coming out. Von Mises, Node, Armanu, DeFi, aka Stevie. Oh my gosh, sorry. Germ. So many awesome friends. Wim. Sorry for folks who I'm forgetting. Scrappy T, but we appreciate you all being out here. Oh, J-Stan, Tib, Calbear. We got an awesome crew. So thank you everybody for coming out. We are really excited because there's a couple of firsts that are happening. So really quickly, we're Collector's Corner. We just geek out on gen art. We love thinking about what's happening with the market, finding new art, talking to amazing artists like MV, other collectors too. And so it's just, this is what we do, all things gen art. And, we have a weekly newsletter I want to highlight because we've been putting a lot of time into that and people are finding a lot of value there. So check out our Twitter. And pinned at the top there in our profile is a weekly newsletter. So please check that out. And my name is Aston Cloud online here. In real life, I don't normally say it. My name's Priyank in real life, but I go by P just because it's way easier for most people. And so, Jared here up on stage is my co-host, Jared_Pause. He is also, in addition to being my co-host and a father, and having a job, he is building the 8NAP digital asset fund. So check that out. He's awesome. And you guys should really know about him if you don't already. Moving on. So just in really introduction to our guest that we have up here, MV. MV is a fabulous generative artist. And he's amazing technically too. I mentioned this in our introductory tweet thread, but he helped build the minting engine for GM Studio, built his own minting website and engine for his first release, which is called Z-Huge. You can find that on Art Blocks. Did the release Mind the Gap with GM Studio, has a release called Shapes on a Plane on FX Hash. And we're here because we're talking about Render's Game, which is his next release coming out on Art Blocks Monday, February 13th, 1 p.m. Eastern, which is going to be amazing. And so just a huge thank you to MV for coming here and doing this Spaces with us. And I want to tell you really quickly why this is special, because Jared and I, we interview artists and we do deep dives on their collections, and it's just so much fun. We get to hear about the history of the artist, about how they came up with a collection, what were they trying to do, what techniques were they using, and then we dive into the traits, which is really cool for us as collectors. You might say, hey, I really like this one trait that makes everything look really zoomed in, or this other trait that makes everything look really zoomed out. And, Jared is a digital asset investor. I treat some of these as investments. It's also nice to know what the different traits are because you can have a point of view on what the market might like. And perhaps you treat it as something both you hold and as an investment simultaneously. And we think it's really useful to understand these types of things when making those kind of decisions. And so for the first time ever, we're doing this before the collection releases. So just, again, want to say thank you to MV for being willing to do this with us and go on this ride. I think it's going to be amazingly fun, and so we're excited. And honestly, Jared, maybe you can speak to this, but every single time we do one of these, it's like I just want more of the collection. It just gives you such a great relationship with art. It just takes the whole experience to another level.
Yeah, it definitely creates that personal connection with a collection that, Node and I talked about it yesterday. It's emotional, right? You want to be invested in the art and the artist and your story. And what we're going to do today is hopefully tease out, some of those points that hopefully each of you get a better and deeper appreciation of the art and feel a connection. I mean, this is from the limited outputs I've seen. It's an absolutely stunning project, and I'm eager to do a deep dive further into it.
Yes, 100%. And also a first for us. So for anybody who is in the spaces, we're going to have a raffle to give away an allow list spot for Render's Game. And the way that it works is there's 325 pieces for the whole collection. For the public, it's a Dutch auction starting at 8 Ether. There's an artist allow list where MV has given away a few spots to folks that would be 24 hours before the launch. And then one of the ones we're giving away is a collector allow list, which, and correct me if I'm wrong, MV, but I believe it will be active after all of the public mints have happened. But importantly, it's going to be 0.25 Ether, which is criminally low for his work. So this is something that we feel like is an amazing gift that he's giving away. So we really appreciate you doing that for the community.
Yeah, no, that's correct. It's my pleasure. And thank you for letting me do something new with you guys. That's my happy place. I love trying new things, so I really appreciate it. It's awesome to be here with you.
Amazing. And so really quickly, the way the allow list is going to work is it's going to open in 3 minutes, so at 12:10 Eastern, and I'm going to give everybody here the password, and you're going to have to retweet the announcement for this Spaces. I don't normally like to do that, but the goal here is to get as many people as possible to hear about MV, hear about his art, hear about his process. So we really want people who are listening to this to be eligible for this allow list. So you're going to have to retweet that announcement. We'll bring more people in, and we're asking for your email address. We're asking to sign up for our Substack newsletter. It's free. You can cancel it anytime, but this has helped a ton of people, and we think it might help you if you're interested in generative art. But again, zero strings attached. You can literally unsubscribe immediately afterwards. So that's how it'll work. And for everybody listening, I'm about to pin the tweet for the first entry. It'll be 20 minutes, and then we'll have another one that's open for 20 minutes with a different password. Okay, so this way, we're just really trying to maximize the amount of people who are coming in and listening to MV. So the first password for everybody, and I'll say it again 5 minutes before it closes. So the first password is 123. That's it. 3 numbers, 123, and you can register. And I will say this again at 12:25, 5 minutes before it closes. And then we'll have the second one launch off. So just wanted to put that out there. Sorry if we're kind of stuttering through it a little bit. It's the first time doing this, but I appreciate you working with us here. And now I'm going to shut up because I've talked for way too long, and I'll throw it over to Jared as we start talking about MV and Render's Game.
So, MV, I'd like to dig into a little bit of your history in this, but I have to ask, just based on the names of the project, do you have like a second occupation as a comedian? Because I feel like the Render's Game is a play on Ender's Game, which was pointed out to me by Node yesterday, and then Shapes on a Plane might be like Snakes on a Plane. Is there really a second occupation here that we're not aware of?
You know what? It's funny. I like choosing names that I guess go a little bit beyond just sort of a surface level. So if you can think, Render's Game, what is it trying to say with the name there? Is it a comment on the ecosystem? Is it a reference to the old book? Is it, it's something that just, it reminds you of something else, but it's also kind of its own thing, and it leaves a little bit of mystery there. And also a little bit of humor. I think, there's nothing wrong with adding something that's kind of a little tongue-in-cheek nod at your own self and your own work. And I think shapes on a plane particularly made sense because, the sort of isometric view work has sort of been proliferated in this space a bit. It kind of made sense to play with the idea and take it to a concept that I guess is just sort of, reflecting back in on itself a bit more. So, yeah, I try and balance, something a bit serious in the name, but also something, a little bit curious and whimsical in there. So I'm not sure I'm quite a comedian.
No,
I
it's
appreciate
absolutely
the insinuation.
It's brilliant. The Shapes on a Plane in particular is such a appropriate name, and at the same time, it's got that undertone of humor. So, real quick, can you give us a brief overview of you as an artist, how you got into Web3? We always like to tease these out, as I feel we're all early, but I always love enjoying and hearing about each and every person's path to kind of where we are today.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been doing generative art. I mean, I didn't really call it generative art seriously until recently, but I've kind of been taking art, with software and making my own software seriously for probably about 15 years or so. But I think my kind of journey into this started much earlier than that. My mum's actually a fashion designer, and I have these very sort of vivid memories of when I was a kid, sitting, in her studio and kind of watching her go through this process where she would start by kind of sketching this idea very, very roughly, on a piece of paper, working out kind of what the patterns were going to be and, how different parts of this structure would kind of come together. And then she would take these and start converting them into this format that she could use on this um, massive knitting machine. And if you can sort of imagine, me as this tiny kid sort of looking up at these huge looming machines covered in, different needles and different runways for threads. And, it was quite an impressive sort of thing to see. And so she would sort of program these machines by taking this piece of, it looks sort of like acetate that you would use on an overhead projector or something. And on it was all these different lines that would describe each of the individual sort of rows in the pattern that she was trying to make. And she'd take this sketch and she'd manage to work out how do I turn, this machine into creating this garment that I want to see coming out of the other end. And so she'd feed, these rows of, dots and sort of little scribbles to kind of tell the machine what to do into the machine. And each time she would, run the, I think it was called a loom. I'm not entirely sure. My knowledge of creating textiles is not great, but she would run this thing across, and it would sort of carry out those commands and gradually create this structure that would come out, and she would turn that then into the final garment. And it was this lovely, iterative process of her having this idea and putting it into reality through this machine. And so I think that really, at such a young age, it kind of set me down this path of seeing what it meant to be creative with a piece of technology. And it's funny because my mum was never, she was never into computers. She had zero interest in them at all, other than, just using them for this kind of creative service of what she wanted to do. And when I got my first computer when I was about 12 years old, me and a friend, he had an Amiga and I had a sort of really old PC. We just got obsessed with kind of learning about how games were made because we just wanted to play video games all the time, but we wanted to make games that we wanted to play. And I remember discovering this piece of software called Tracker software, which is how a lot of game music used to be made. And a tracker, it uses this type of format called a mod file. And really all that is lines of commands sort of vertically that the computer would step through, and each command it would sort of carry out. So you'd say, hey, I want this note in this particular beat of the bar, and I want this note in this particular beat of the bar, and then you could put, little commands to tell the computer what instrument or how it would express that. And it made this very clear sort of direct connection in my head with what my mum was doing on those knitting machines, which was to kind of give it these sort of commands for each line. And so I think somewhere, that connection sent me down this path of starting to be really creative with, or at least trying to be creative with computers when I was really young. And I quickly sort of wanted to learn, well, how do these commands work? How do I make better commands? How do I start trying to understand how even this particular piece of software is made? And I think that's kind of a narrative that's stretched its way through most of my journey to where I am today. This idea that by understanding machines better, by understanding kind of how they work and what they do, we can better express our creative ideas, or have different ideas that maybe someone else hasn't seen. We're not limited just by what the tracker tells us we can do, or what by that knitting machine, my mum would let her do. We can kind of expand out a little bit from that. And, that led me into kind of ending up writing my own music software. And I spent quite a few years building sort of synth engines and lots of different things that kind of let me express myself in different ways. And I found this thing called the demo scene, which is a sort of interesting subculture, mostly sort of operated through kind of IRC and real life meetups, where people would compete with effectively writing interesting graphics and sound and anything that you could kind of make on a computer as a demo. And then they'd compete against each other to sort of judge who kind of did the best demo. And a lot of it was about, how small we can make the software and how much expression can we get into this, this little piece of software that we're then kind of distributing out. And so, that was a really fertile time for me. I wasn't an amazing coder back then at all, but I was, through that, it kind of set me on this path of trying to learn a lot more about the kind of fundamentals.
Well, this is awesome. I mean, essentially, every piece of art that you release into the wild is this really amalgamation of a lot of life's experience, which I think is essential to everybody else's. I'm really fascinated with the influence that your mother had on this. Is there anything in particular from the aesthetics or the creation? Because all of your pieces to me seem to have a particular flow to it. I mean, they're obviously not the same, but like, is there any correlation or call it common theme for that?
Well, it's interesting you say that. So because I learned like DSP and learning how to make a lot of the sort of software and the generative stuff early on with music, in an audio space. A lot of the application of how I think about modifying even simple things like noise fields. I just immediately apply my ideas of sort of audio synthesis. So, filtering things in certain ways, different types of ways to compress sort of noise fields so that you can end up with these much more lilting, kind of interesting flows in the movement of the piece, even if the noise is not necessarily visible and present. And I actually think, a lot of, I think it's very easy to just go and get a noise algorithm and, put that in your piece and just use that to kind of move something around or influence it in a certain way. But, I think for me, it's very much about making that my own through the kind of skills that I've learned on how to sort of modify those things. So I'm really glad you see that. Actually, I don't think anyone's really pointed that out in that way before. I guess that is slightly different from the way that maybe I see other people use those techniques.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, it's like hard for me to fathom somebody creating such good visual art, and then you have the music, and I'm sure your code is just as beautiful. So it really, I think it's amazing for folks to hear just how long you've been focused on this and working on these techniques and what that's led to. Super, super impressive.
And I think, sorry, P, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, please go ahead.
Apologies. I was going to say, I think it's funny because as I've got older, I remember reflecting on, seeing my mum learning how to use this machine and thinking, well, that's the hard bit. The hard bit is learning how to understand the machine and make the machine work in the way that you want to, and then even, playing around with and modifying the machine or changing the stuff around it. But I've realized, I think this is part of maturing as an adult and as an artist. But I've realized actually the hard bit is really understanding how to express yourself and what it is that you want to put into that in the first place. It doesn't matter how good you are at sort of learning the fundamentals of a machine or a system. It still really comes down to everything else that goes around that. What are you inspired by? What moves you? What experiences are you having with things that you can kind of pour into that. And yeah, I think a lot of the stuff that I try and do is sort of trying to find what feels like myself, in those environments. What is emotional to me. And I didn't realize that, I think, until a lot later on in kind of doing music and art. It was something where I was just so focused on the technology that I kind of didn't spend enough time with all of the stuff that made that meaningful. So that's why I say, I've only really been doing this for, I think, the last, 15 odd years, sort of somewhat seriously, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and I think it's funny. Just as I get older and more accepting of myself, I think I'd be more able to put myself into that creative process. But I wanted to. That's actually a perfect transition, MV, to Render's Game, and just so everybody knows, we're saying MV. Mount Vitruvius is Anthony's artist name, but MV for short. So in case you're wondering, that's where the MV comes from. And one super quick shout out for the allow list. It's going to close in 9 minutes. You have to click on the link that's pinned up here. And the password, again, is just 123. Literally that, nothing else. This one closes in 9 minutes. We'll open up another one at 12:40, which will be open for another 20 minutes for folks who are coming in afterwards. Sorry for the little house cleaning stuff. Let's talk about Render's Game. You told me when we were talking one-on-one about the inspiration for this. I would love for you to share that story because I think it's amazing and fits in perfectly with what you're saying about, what inspires you and how you try to translate that to art.
Yeah, no worries. I think it was about a year ago that I sort of had that moment of kind of realizing there was something that I wanted to do. I was in Paris with my wife. We were visiting the Paratine Gallery, and Paratine's a fantastic gallery. They put on a lot of artists, I have a huge amount of respect for. And there's an exhibition on by a gentleman called Li Bei. He primarily works in charcoal, and he'll go through a lot of natural processes with the charcoal to then kind of turn it into these pieces that are just kind of otherworldly. And I remember walking into the gallery, and the first piece in the exhibit was, I forget the name of it in French, but it translates to "from fire." And they're these huge canvases, which are, they almost look like the sort of monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey. But they're made from bits of charcoal, these kind of skimmed, and sort of reassembled in this very meticulous way onto these canvases, and they're gigantic. And the charcoal actually extends like all the way around the edges of these things, so it just looks like someone's, taken this huge block directly out of a giant slab of charcoal, and this kind of crystalline, intricate structure sort of emerges from it. And when you see pictures of these things, they really just don't do them justice in the slightest. You kind of have to be in that environment in a gallery and see the way that the light falls on them. And I remember just standing in front of this thing and seeing all these really intricate fractures and structures and the ways that they sort of intertwined themselves. So you could almost see each of the individual sort of blocks that kind of fit together. But then inside, he had all these different sort of semi-fractured structures that kind of made these almost, fractal-like looking assemblages. And I was just in awe. It was like, it was a little bit like that scene in 2001: A Space Odyssey with the monolith, right? Rising up out of the sand. It feels both unbelievably natural, but also like it shouldn't really be there, and almost like it couldn't possibly exist. And so, in my mind, I took like a little note of sort of how I felt staring at this thing and kind of being in this presence of it. And I sort of wondered in the back of my mind for a while, like, how could I remake something that made me feel like that? What was the thing that kind of triggered that in me? And it took me a few months, and it was actually, so this was before Shapes on a Plane. This was kind of, I sort of realized I wanted to do something, but I didn't really know how to do it. And then, a few months, it was about a month or so, I think, after I'd finished Shapes on a Plane, I was sort of exploring different ideas around algorithms, and I kind of came back to this idea of it. And yeah, I started piecing together some of the algorithms I thought could kind of help me restructure that sense of feeling. And yeah, go ahead. Sorry, you were going to say something, Jared.
No, I was going to interrupt your flow, so I apologize. Trying to pull in the inspiration for charcoal. I'm looking at Mint Zero on Art Blocks right now, a Render's game, and there's a beautiful integration in my opinion, of color and different patterning amongst all the different shapes. Where did that come into? Because I mean, there's even within the patterning of triangles, you have some that are center focused, some that are just like, I'll call it triangles that become smaller and smaller in a concentric fashion. I just hearing your story, it's like there's almost like this draw from a tapestry, the inspiration from your mother, and the art that you just referenced in Paris. Am I extrapolating too much, or are you able to, maybe, no pun intended, but shed some color on how then all of that came out into Render's game?
Yeah, no, of course. And the bit you've just touched on is actually how we've kind of ended up with this sort of like science fiction naming scheme. It feels like a big jump, right? Going from that beautiful piece by Lee Bay to how do we get to sort of futurism in science fiction? But to me, I'm fascinated by futurism as a concept. Growing up, Ender's Game was one of my very favorite books, and it sent me down this path of learning more about the history of futurism as a subject. And I actually mentioned 2001: A Space Odyssey as one of the experiences I felt when, this idea of the monolith, when I was looking at this piece, and that, when I dug into that feeling, that's one of the things that I grabbed onto there. It was like, how can I bring out something that's kind of my experience of that feeling of being in front of this piece? And I'm a huge fan of people like Arthur C. Clarke. There's certain futurists that are just able to predict kind of where things are going to go many, many, many years before you'd even think it possible. So Arthur C. Clarke is amazing. If you see a geostationary satellite, which is when you see a little point of light that obviously isn't a star kind of floating above you in the night sky, the process of a satellite being geostationary is called the Clarke orbit, because Arthur C. Clarke, the science fiction writer, came up with the idea for how that would work as part of one of his stories, and that actually got adopted by NASA. So NASA ended up sort of being influenced by that. And on the sort of the flip side of that, if you actually watch the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, you see within the first hour of that film so many things that we just take for granted now. It feels like a contemporary film. You see someone sitting there with an iPad, browsing the news. The internet didn't exist. It was in the 1950s. None of this stuff had even sort of begun to be imagined. You see someone having a Skype conversation. You see spaceships that actually take on a similar structure to kind of how they actually do work now today. Light sort of structures with, various pods attached to them to kind of enable them to be moved up there and built. And this ability for that guy to just see so much of how today was going to operate, it just, it absolutely blows my mind. And so his collaboration with, so when they put together the film 2001: A Space Odyssey, him and Kubrick, just really stuck with me as something that was very important for me to remember. And there's a parable here to kind of what I think we're doing in the crypto space. When generative art sort of first sort of moved into the crypto space, and people, great people like Def Beef were, putting these programs on chain that people could run, they were challenging this idea of the future of ownership. They were challenging this idea. They were futurists in that regard, thinking about what digital ownership versus physical ownership was going to end up representing, or what it meant to, buy a piece of art from a program, in a sense, kind of co-creating it. And, how that challenges the current conceptions of art. So, while it seems like a leap, in my mind, all of these things are sort of, parables of a similar voice. And so a lot of the inspiration in Render's Game comes from kind of honoring the past, the futurists of the past that have remained relevant even today. And I think there's a lot of bad sort of cyberpunk dystopian kind of visions, and I really wanted to try and distance this piece from that. So even even if you look at the video that I put out, it's trying to reflect, what I see as the kind of lasting means of what we see as kind of a potential future, and how that looks, and sort of how that then touches on, going from something, as you said, like this structural Libe piece into something that's got this kind of slightly more futuristic, sort of old but recognizable science fiction kind of feel to it. So that was really kind of the connection between those two pieces. And in the palettes, you'll see references to a lot of this. I think we're going to talk about them maybe later on, so I'll go through them in that sense.
Yeah, no, Aston has a question, but I'm so eager to dive into palettes. I'm going to bite my tongue too.
Oh, so many good palettes and so many features. Jared and I, both coming from an engineering background, like to nerd out on the analytics side and break things down. But before we get to that, I'm just really fascinated by how you went from this artistic intent and seeing the Libe piece and the charcoal, and then figuring out which algorithms to use. Like, maybe you can talk a tiny bit about that process, and also what algorithms you ended up really utilizing. Just, it's almost helpful for us to even hear the names and learn about what some of these algorithms are.
Yeah, sure. So one of the other pieces, the bit I think we missed in the reference was cubism, and that was actually the kind of, you don't see cubism in the piece necessarily, but that was the inspiration for the process behind the algorithm, and it was the piece that the piece of the puzzle that took it from just being, these interesting sort of structures into something that actually ended up being, I think a lot more interesting. But if anyone opens up, just Google Libe and look at the From Fire pieces that he's done, you'll kind of see what I'm talking about. But as I was talking about these kind of lines that sort of form structure, and then these sort of shapes and these masses that end up kind of crystallized, I sort of had it in my mind of how to achieve that. And there's a couple of sort of classic sort of computer science problems, which I like to implement most of my algorithm, or all of the algorithms actually, for my work that I publish myself, to truly understand how they work. So then you can sort of manipulate them or change them or adjust them in ways that you wouldn't necessarily know how to do if you didn't make them. So the first piece of the puzzle was working out how to do a really efficient Delaunay triangulation, which I think the easiest way to imagine it is if you imagine you're holding a handful of sand, maybe 200 little grains of sand, and you throw them out onto a table. A Delaunay triangulation, the goal is to try and draw a line or three lines to kind of connect three of those pieces of sand into a perfect triangle, but doing it in such a way that none of them overlap, and that there's no degenerate triangles. So that means, no triangles that are missing a side or two sides. And it's a really nice little concise sort of computer science problem. So I knew that was going to give me some of this kind of depth and structure if I could change the way that you would sort of, throw those pieces of sand out onto the table. But it wasn't, interesting enough sort of on its own. I needed to work out a good way of kind of bringing structure to the piece. And cubism, the philosophy for cubism is that you kind of, you see an object and then you deconstruct it down into its component form. I'm not an expert on this, by the way. This is just, cursory reading of kind of cubist past and history. And I find these sort of things really inspiring for thinking about how I actually implement an algorithm. But the cubist process is to kind of see an object and kind of deconstruct it down into its very sort of base form, and then reassemble it in a sort of an interpretation, your own personal interpretation of what that looks like. And so for me, once I got this kind of triangulation process working, another part of the puzzle there was actually learning how to do something called a hobby curve, which is, again, there's a really good paper on how hobby curves operate. But, let's say we threw that handful of sand out on the table again. The goal of a hobby curve is to say, well, let me number each one of these little grains of sand. And then how do I draw a perfect curve that curves right the way through each one of those grains of sand in turn? So those are kind of the two main structural components of how Render's game works. The way it works is that there's a bunch of different ways that the sand can be thrown out. There's a bunch of different ways that those grains of sand can be given order. And then we draw, these hobby curves over it to kind of coax these structures out of those grains of sand. And then from that, we run Delaunay triangulations to effectively find all of these kind of interesting structures and intersections between the lines and between the grains of sand. And then there's a process of taking all of that apart. So if you imagine the renders game algorithm running, if you've run it, you'll see that it does this process of saying preparing and then sketching and then eventually illustrating. Well, the preparing and sketching is just all maths. There's nothing being drawn to the screen. It's this process of creating this structure and taking it apart again. And the only time it actually draws anything is in the sort of illustrating step towards the end there. But when it's sort of built this structure, it starts taking it apart again, and it uses going back to the kind of DSP stuff I was talking about before. This idea of processing things with noise and processing things with kind of like my audio sensibility. It uses two different fields to then deconstruct and reconstruct the geometry again. So it does another Delaunay pass after it's kind of taken all of these pieces of geometry apart. That's probably a bit abstract. I hope some of that made sense. I think if you look at the debug views, so keys 1 to 4 on your keyboard, if you're looking at one of the pieces, you can see number 1 actually shows you those grains of sand. Number 2 shows you the curves that are created from all of those grains of sand. Then number 3 and number 4 are showing you the maps that it uses to then deconstruct the piece before it's reassembled. So if you toggle between 5 actually re-renders the piece, but if you toggle between 3 and 4, you should be able to see kind of where 3 is a complete mask, so it'll actually remove elements within that space, and 4 is actually used in a couple of different ways depending on the genome to then reconstruct the triangles within the context of the space. So actually the whole piece is made of triangles and lines.
That's pretty cool. A lot of that went way over my head, but I hope that some of the listenership can gain something from it, and even the toggling between 3 and 4. It's one of the things I'm loving about generative art, and specifically to this is the level of engagement and the ability for the end collector to further dive into it deeper. That level of engagement, I think, is something that as people discover gen art and they explore the pieces more, it will create that greater connection to it. So, and hopefully, some of the listenership, when you acquire your pieces, this level of insight will help each and every one of you connect to the piece a little bit further. So thank you for sharing that. That was actually very insightful. I'm playing between 3 and 4 right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, for anybody listening, try to hop on your computer, go to Art Blocks, go to the Renders game page, and follow along. I'm throwing some tweets up here as well so folks can see. So if you look at some of the pinned tweets, we have a Lee Base from Fire, and there's a link to the website for that as well, so you can check that out. And I also just recently linked to our tweet thread where there are some of the images of Renders game outputs here as we start talking through that. And last house cleaning thing, the second allow list. So if you missed the first allow list and you're just joining, there's a second link up there. It's going to open up in 1 minute. The password for this one is 456. We changed it up to make sure you're actually listening to join that one. So I'll shout that out one more time with 5 minutes left. But no, Envy, it's amazing to hear about these techniques. And, I also am a novice. I don't know about these, but the more I can hear about them, the more I can start learning and start understanding how you all do part of what you do and really the intricacies and complexities behind it. And so I appreciate you taking the time to explain that. And I do think that, as Jared mentioned, collectors can go back and listen to this and see, okay, like that's how it worked. Like that's how it was constructed. And that's really, really fun for us to feel like not only are we getting this fantastic art, but we're learning something too. So really appreciate you going through that. And I'm going to pin one more tweet up here. So this is the 5th tweet pinned up here. And I just took some screenshots of the different traits of Render's game. So we can now start chatting through them But maybe we should start with palettes because you have so many palettes. I think 20 or so, perhaps more than that. And so for folks, either go to the ArtBlocks website and check out Render's Game and click on all items, and you'll be able to see all the different palettes, or just take a look at the images here that we put up. But yeah, you have palettes with fantastic names. We have Sin, we have Dark Crystals, Charcoal. I could guess what that one was about. But I'd love to hear which one of these are, maybe you could tell us which are some of your favorites and any others you want to highlight.
Yeah, sure. So you nailed it on Charcoal there, P. That is absolutely a direct reference to the experience that I had with Lee Bay's work, and that was the first palette actually that I put into the piece. It was just a thank you to Lee for his beautiful work and the inspiration. Not that I don't even know if he'll look at it, but it just made sense to me. I think a lot of the other palettes, there's a few, so things like Olivetti, Beige Box, the Randy palette. They kind of reference some of that sort of I guess the sort of science progression that I've always found so interesting. As how do I describe? I'm just trying to think of the best way to describe this. So I've always been fascinated by obviously futurism and kind of old sort of ideals of the future, and a lot of that kind of got manifested in the sort of 80s and the 70s in computer advertising or the sort of materials that we made around computing. So I have a huge love for the kind of 1950s Olivetti posters, for example, which was like super early sort of typewriters that sort of started to become a little bit more intelligent, we should say, and sort of started unlocking people to do little, slightly cleverer things. And some of the artists I think who were doing those posters were people like Cooper Hewitt and Giovanni Pintori, who just do the most wonderful sort of screen print-esque graphics work. So, like the Olivetti palette, I think will probably be the most contentious palette potentially among the sets. Very bright and very vibrant. It's kind of my sort of interpretation, I think, of kind of how those palettes probably looked and felt at that time. I hope those land. I think that's probably one of my favorite ones. Then things like Beige Box, that's a nod to the work that Paul Rand was doing for people like Xerox, and the amazing logo that he did for Next. These kind of futurist visions of what graphics could look like around computing. Taking into consideration all of the graphics technology that kind of existed then, and they're just lovely bookmarks in the history of kind of futurism and computing combined. So, those are some of my favorite ones. There's two that pique my interest, just purely by the name. One is Fisher Price, which having little kids, my brain just goes to automatically. But also the Frank Minimal. What can you explain maybe some of the intent behind those two? Those seem to be captivating just from a naming perspective. Yeah, so Fisher Price is actually a palette that I originally put together for Mind the Gap. There's a few palettes here actually that they're not the same palettes. They're sort of modifications to kind of work with these pieces. But you can actually find a couple of pieces. Fisher Price is one of them that goes all the way back to Mind the Gap, and you'll also find it in Shapes on a Plane. But that piece, so Fisher Price particularly, was about the experience that I had as a kid, playing with these primary colors, making something really joyful, but also slightly chaotic and messy at the same time. And it just felt such a perfect fit for Mind the Gap, and actually it works really well in this context too. So that's more of a continuation than it is necessarily iteration on a theme. The Frank palette is from some of Frank Lloyd Wright's work. I've always really loved sort of beautiful architectural drawings and sketches, and I've just found his use of color really emotive. And there's a couple of really sort of modernist, sort of futurist sketches that I'd seen of his work that just kind of really felt like they resonated for the piece with me. I think, my approach to making palettes is more trying to focus on the memory of my experience or my feelings around it to kind of come up with the right set of colors to greater or lesser success. And, rather than just go, okay, well, I'm going to take these particular colors, if that makes sense. So some of them, Olivetti's a good example. You won't find those exact combinations in any of the work by Kipiher or Giovanni Pintori is what I imagine that feeling would have been at that particular point in time.
So just because I've clicked render through some of the explore possibilities over and over again, and what I'm fascinated with is you get these pieces that have almost like a stained glass type of color variation throughout all the different triangulated, I'll call it sand pieces. And then you have these others. I mean, I clicked one that was just like, I mean, it was all purple. Is there a controlling trait that maybe, and again, I'm a big fanboy of Ori by James Merrill, but he has this trait called exclusive, but exclusive, right? Where all of a sudden it takes the palette and it emphasizes one particular color. Is there something similar there, or what's kind of governing that output, if you don't mind me digging into a little bit of details there?
Yeah, no problem. So there's a few ways that colors can be applied. So actually at the end of the algorithm, what it does is it takes all of this reconstructed geometry and it goes through every single triangle and every single line, and it sorts each triangle into a list with the biggest triangles at the top and the smallest triangles at the very bottom. And it says, okay, how many of these triangles do I want to give some sort of detail to? And it can either roll a detail or it can roll a color. But the rolling of that dice is determined by another noise field, so that it will depend on the structure of the rest of the piece as to what gets given color. And it will also depend on the tension of the noise field overall across the piece. And again, with the compression and the high pass or low pass, sort of what that will pick up. So it actually really varies a lot. If you end up with a really tight noise field, you can end up with these, very stark contrasts between colors. So I'll iterate through the palette really quickly and you'll end up seeing, 4 or 5 different colors in a really small area. Whereas if the noise field is much looser or the piece is much looser in the way that everything's been reconstructed, you might suddenly start seeing similar colors sitting together. There's also a big variation in the palettes actually of kind of the range of hues and sort of the contrast in the colors that are sort of set as accents. So aubergine mono is probably the purple one that you mentioned, and that doesn't have a huge amount of additional kind of accent colors to it. It's it's a lot more uniform as a palette, but it ends up being a lot more subtle as a kind of overall experience. So there's a lot of there's quite a bit of complexity in how the palette will interact with the traits within the piece. So I think you'll end up seeing palettes actually looking extremely different across multiple different pieces. And part of the joy for me is letting that natural process kind of take its place. So I'm intrigued to see what people enjoy out of them.
Well, I wanted to commend you just because as I go through this more and more, the palettes, and I don't know a better word for this, but they just look fresh. They don't feel like they've been repurposed. I mean, obviously, Fisher Price, actually, I love that palette on Mind the Gap, but the outputs I've seen, they don't feel like repurposed. They actually feel very original. So I wanted to commend you on finding a way to bring the coloration and the geometry together in a way that was, for me, at least personally speaking, very captivating.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a lot of tweaking,
but it's great, right? Like that's what this is all about, and to hear the amount of effort and time and consideration, and quite honestly, I'm hearing an undertone of pride that you're taking in your work. I just wanted to commend you and say that it definitely shows.
Thank you, Pete. That means a lot. I appreciate it.
We're going to go through some more of these traits, and the depth of thought that you went into this, I think, will be really apparent to all the listeners. And this is something I just wanted to point out really quick. Like, we know that you are a full-time artist. This is what you spend a lot of time on. This is not easy to do. But sometimes I think it can be lost on us, even Jared and I, when we're interviewing artists, about just the level of complexity and, like I said, the thought that goes into all of these decisions. And so I really appreciate that as well, and you taking the time to explain these. And I will say I've gone through a bunch of these iterations. They are fantastic. Like, I didn't feel like there was obviously they're all the same algorithm, and there's that connection, that string that ties it all together, but they are very, very varied. So you did a really good job in mixing that up and doing long form well. And before we dive into some of the other categories here, Super quickly, the second allow list, there's 10 minutes left. There's one of the links up here that I pinned will take you there. It should end in collectors-corner-2. And the password for that is 456. Folks have been asking. So the last time I'll put it out there. And so now I can fully focus on deconstructing some of this art. And the plan is we'll kind of talk through some more traits for 10 minutes. And then at the hour, we'll have folks come up and ask questions if they have any questions for MV. So, and I also pinned another tweet up here, as I mentioned, that has a snapshot of all the traits that are out there. So MV, we've got about 10 minutes here. What would you like to highlight? Perhaps genome base you had mentioned before. Well, I'll let you decide, but what do you think what would you like to explain to folks here as to what these different traits lead to aesthetically?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the genome base is probably the best one to dig into a bit more. I think the way to think about the genomes is they're not fixed. A filled is not always going to look exactly the same. A giant is not always going to look exactly the same. I think the way to think about those is almost like circles on a Venn diagram that all overlap in the middle. So it's really just the starting point of where the algorithm begins. And there's a whole space that they can explore. And sometimes they'll overlap into other spaces as well. So you might find a field that looks a lot like a giant, or a giant that looks a lot like a deconstruct, or a deconstruct that looks a lot like a fragment. But that's intentional. These are just kind of ways of almost categorizing the sort of aesthetic of each of them, which I think is quite helpful. It's also there in the code. I use it as a creative way of actually defining certain chunks, I would say, out of the kind of latent space of all of the pieces that can exist in this piece. And they each individually, you should notice kind of a difference between how they operate. I've been putting a couple of tweets out to give a bit more description of sort of the pure looking versions of those. But I think it's going to be the ones that are in between those that people are probably going to find the most interesting. I mean, I've spent a lot of time with this algorithm, and those are the ones that I find the most interesting, most definitely. As we've only got 10 minutes left, maybe if there's any particular trait you guys want to go through, by all means, give me a shout.
Well, I do think it would be awesome to talk about the Straussian true or false, since that's like a
Web3
that's
Easter
true.
egg. That's
Yes.
very, very true. So I'm a big fan of Andrew Strauss's work. So Archiplex was one of my favorite pieces that he created quite a while ago now, actually, that I collected. And when I mentioned this idea of sort of construction and then deconstruction of the piece, one of the processes in the deconstruction is that it removes a lot of the sort of structural elements that sit outside of the bounds of these intersected lines. And when I switched that off, I started getting these pieces that ended up looking and feeling like they reminded me a little bit of maybe how Archiplex could have worked. And so I pinged Andrew and I said, hey, this is kind of reminding me a little bit of your work. Firstly, is this okay? And he was like, yeah, it's cool. He's a really lovely guy. And then I said, would it be all right if I turned that into a trait for the piece to kind of honor what you've done with Archiplex? And he said, yeah, no worries, go for it. And, I don't think they look very similar at all. Still, obviously around his game. But it was just a nice nod to an artist who I have a huge amount of respect for.
Yeah, I love that Easter egg. And I also love how it is, you can draw inspiration from other artists, and the community is open enough for you to build upon that. I think that modularized nature of code seems to cross over into generative art quite beautifully. So I think that's a really cool one that you entered in there. Another one maybe we could ask about really quickly is the border. I know borders are often in gen art, and you have one here that says construction lines. I was curious, what is a construction lines border?
That's a really good pick, actually, Jared. So the border actually does make a huge difference to the resultant look of the piece. When there's no border, the geometry can effectively draw itself well outside the bounds of the canvas if it wants to. So you end up with these kind of big structures that can sort of overlap the border. Construction lines you'll recognize. It's when the lines within the piece, when you have filled lines that sort of, show the original structure, or at least a peek at what the original structure looked like, they start to become sketches towards the very edge of the border. And it just felt like a really nice way to kind of contain a subject within the piece. So I really like the construction lines look. And then margin is very simple. It's really just a fixed width border that kind of frames the piece inside. But the border will often be either the background color or the line color, depending on how the piece is actually set within the canvas. And I believe there is another one. The name is not off the tip of my tongue. Yes, detail gap. So detail gap's an interesting one. What it does is it looks at all of the geometry that's in the scene, and it just checks to see, okay, is any geometry kind of escaping this particular scene? Is it sort of overlapping with the space outside the border? And it will just prune any geometry that would have sat there. So what you end up with is this very kind of natural sort of contained structure, rather than it being something that kind of escapes from the bounds. So really a lot of these are just, processes of kind of trying to find a subject and find a focus for, this sort of reconstruction process. And so the border does actually have a big impact on how the eventual piece looks.
I noticed through some of the outputs that I've been perusing, the lines in between all the different shapes end up having a coloration. Is that palette dependent, or is that another trait? Are we picking up on something unique? What can we tease out here?
The lines between the different shapes end up having a coloration. What do you mean by that?
The literally the lines in between all the triangles, they're almost weaves in through. One particular output, I don't have it up on screen anymore, but had like a purple, instead of like a hard black line in between all the different shapes, there was like almost like a purple coloration to it, which seemed very
and sometimes
unique.
they're white. So like between the geometries in the middle of the piece, the lines that segment the geometries.
I see. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Are you talking about the sort of thick lines that kind of run through the piece, or are you talking about the fragments
Thick lines.
specifically?
Thick lines.
Yeah. So those thick lines will get given a color depending on a bunch of factors within the piece. One of them is what type of border does it have. Another one is what is the genome that I'm running from. Those are chosen from a smaller subset of the original palette. So you might find lines that are, there's one actually which is a really good example. I forget which palette it is now. But it was, you'll see these really intensely pink lines kind of running through the scene. And sometimes they're pink and sometimes they're not pink. But the pink ones I kind of left that in as a bit of an Easter egg because the palette really reminds me, if you go and look at the original book of Ender's Game, it's this beautiful science fiction scene, but it has this vibrant pink Ender's Game writing on the front of it. So that was kind of a nice little Easter egg. And so the line is often used as kind of an accent to play with the border and then to kind of break up the structure, if that makes sense. But the line itself can be different colors depending on how the palette is utilized.
There you go. We finally teased out an Easter egg. We were finally able to get one out of you. Thank you for sharing. Any other Easter eggs before we bring up some audience members that you would feel comfortable sharing? I always like to ask the question. You never know unless you ask, right?
There are so many properties. So it's funny because when I'm making this piece, I'm not thinking about metadata. Like the metadata is kind of an afterthought for me. There's actually a tweet that I put out, I think it was a few weeks ago now, that showed kind of like a debug view of what Render's Game looks like when I'm making it. And down the left-hand side, you can see a list of all of the properties that I'm thinking about when a piece is kind of being generated. And so I think about those properties. But, in terms of you asking whether there's Easter eggs in the code, well, go and have a look at just how many properties there are, in that list that are not as, simple as what we see in kind of the metadata, because that's really how I think about the piece itself. There is one trait, there is one that's not listed in the metadata that is pretty unlikely, I think, to come out in the final set, but might happen, and we'll see. And I think everyone will probably know if that happens. I'm not going to say any more than that.
Damn, you had me on the edge of my seat. I was shoveling the popcorn in my mouth, waiting for the delivery, and we're just gonna have to wait. I can't wait.
I hope it's whoever wins the allow list that they get that one MV. That would be something.
That would be awesome.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing all this. We wanted to open up to the audience here. We have Ron Crypto who's requested. So, Ron, how are you doing? And yeah, what would you like to ask MV?
While Ron's figuring out the mute button, I'll ask one question. And again, audience members, please feel free to hop up. I know some of you guys are at work listening in the background, which we greatly appreciate, just the listenership. And if you do want to come up and ask, now's your time. But is there any output that maybe in your dream state, MV, you're hoping to see? Is there anything that, fingers crossed, you hope the algorithm pukes it out?
There is a really interesting interaction that can happen with fragment and some of the scale property. So scale is an interesting one because what it does is it resizes the whole bounds of the space that it builds this structure in the first place, and it lets the structure be much, much larger. So if you have a small scale, it's like taking all of the stuff that you would normally see in a renders game and making it much smaller, and then letting the rest of the space also be used as part of the canvas. But there's a really interesting sort of interaction between the fragment genome and that particular scale property when it gets down to sort of the small end that I'm sort of secretly hoping we'll see pop out. I would love to see I'd love to see that come out of the results. So, I mean, as I say, like, these are all the space between all of these genomes and all of these different traits and all of the things that you see in the code example I sent. There's a lot of space there. So, it'll be interesting to see what we get.
Yeah, you're toying with something. I mean, I love when you can play around in the extremes of the algorithm. There was a mega trait in that trait also, correct?
Yes, there is.
Yeah, and I think I've kind of figured that one out. But yeah, I think there's like tiny, mega, small, and one other. Not that I'm obsessing over the traits already, but
it's actually I just have to go and check. It's contrast range where you've got the mega.
Gotcha. Yeah, that one I'm curious to see how that affects things. But I'm glad to see Node came up on stage. We were fanboying over the project yesterday. So, is there anything in particular you wanted to ask?
Yeah, well, maybe just to continue the fanboying, it looks amazing. So I wanted to just say thank you. And I'm also, curious. You now, I feel like you're bridging the gap. No pun intended, right? You've done GM down, now you've done art blocks, which I think it's so cool to see that you're doing that. How has that experience been, kind of working in both sides of the equation? And then one other question that I have is, forgive my ignorance if this has been mentioned somewhere, but will there be printable components to this? Because I think this would look good on paper as well.
Yeah, thank you, Node. That's really great to hear. I really appreciate it. Thanks, buddy. So working across all of these different things, I think, it's funny because for me, I think as we sort of said, we're trying to do something new here, and I love trying to do something new because a lot of the time that forces me to learn something new. So, when I built my own whole thing for Zhuge and then sort of moved into, Cypher invited me to come and join GMDAO, and, we were talking about building a studio. It felt like the right place to be for me, making something new, trying something different. And we did some really cool stuff that I don't think, GMDAO gets enough credit for. Like, you can actually bring any type of code to GM Studio. It doesn't have to be written in JavaScript. You can write a shell script, right? And we can work out how to put that on chain and render it. The system is so malleable, and it was interesting because that came from. Well, I mean, I was discussing this with the team there, and we were talking about like, what some of my challenges were kind of doing Z huge, and, that wasn't written in JavaScript, for example, but all of the platforms that exist out there were kind of JavaScript focused. So, getting to try new things and sort of open up some new opportunities kind of just felt like the right space. It was never a conscious choice for me of, do I want to do it on Art Blocks or do I want to do it on GM Studio? Obviously I've always wanted to do a piece on Art Blocks because, they've set the standard in sort of telling this story. And I think the community they've built and the platform that they've built is just absolutely incredible. For me, I wanted to go through that process of kind of learning a lot about that myself, So yeah, I guess I'm kind of working across these things. I want to obviously do something that's meaningful for Art Blocks, and be part of that ecosystem is so important to me. But yeah, I don't really feel like I'm kind of choosing sides, if that makes sense.
Totally.
And I hope people don't see it that way.
No, and that's why I think it's so great, right? It's artists working wherever you can, and kind of breaking down those boundaries. So absolutely love it.
Cool, thank you. Your second question, I think, was on prints. So I love doing prints. If you go on my website, you can order prints of any of the pieces that you might hold of mine, and I do a lot of test prints in advance to make sure that they look really good. They're made here in London by my favorite print shop, and I'll sign them and ship them out to you guys. So yeah, I will definitely be opening up prints for this one. I'm looking forward to it.
I'll love it. Thank you so much for all the info.
Well,
my pleasure.
Node shared with me yesterday. He's down to 9 ETH, so I have a sneaking suspicion after this mint he might be a little bit further down on his reserves. So,
dude, I've already done a raffle twice here, so I don't know if we're allowed to do it twice, but I did it the first time and the second time. So fingers crossed here. That is for sure.
No, I'm looking forward to the mint. Again, anybody listening, there's open forum to come up and ask a question of MV. Please feel free to hop in. Definitely an opportunity that I don't think a lot of people have is to have that artist direct connection. So please feel free to come up and ask that burning question.
Yeah, and Ronnie,
yo.
Thanks for coming on stage.
Yo, what's up? Yo, I really love the art render games. It's amazing. I have been the holder of the Mind the Game, a gap, I guess. That's also really cool. So I just want to ask, like, for the allow list, right? Will the holder get a chance to probably raffle for allow list for the render games?
Not in this case. So MV had some artist allow lists, and then for us, it's just going to be the raffle for this specific spaces here.
I see.
Yeah. But sorry, go ahead, MV.
That's all good. There was I do have my own Discord. I kind of try and keep it pretty small. I might have just made a mistake in mentioning it. But there are some kind of long-term old school collectors there, and we have a little sort of community for people who do hold pieces. So yeah, if there was going to be one of those, it would probably start there.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
No worries.
And MV, I have a question for you. As this doesn't pertain specifically to Render's game, but it could. A lot of artists have opened up Discords and are really leaning into the Web3 community building, oftentimes based on a specific collection. Gazers comes to mind, where there's like the Gazers Discord. How do you think about that, if you have so far, in terms of this more direct relationship with your collectors that is pretty unique to Web3 at the moment?
Yeah, it's not something... I don't think it was something that I'd really intentionally, pursued in a sense. I think, my Discord, for example, I didn't even set that up. That was done by a few people who just really loved my first piece, and they said, "Hey, you've really got to kind of put this together. We'd love to have a place that we can hang out and talk about this work." And it was amazing because they, as a community, came together. put it together. They helped me understand how to structure all of that, and so it was really built by them, in a way. And it's such an honor to have that happen. And I think this is just how we work now. This being in contact with everyone all the time through text, through platforms, and yeah, I love it. It reminds me so much of when I was doing demo scene stuff when I was sort of 13, 14 years old, sitting at home on IRC in the farm I grew up in. So it's amazing how little of that has kind of changed in a sense. But I do think me being an artist and trying to sort of understand a bit about what people's experiences of my work. It's the hardest thing to do once you've been working on something for so long, to get a bit of perspective and be able to take that step back and imagine kind of what someone's experience of that's going to be for the first time. It's just so incredible to be able to do that within, 10 seconds, put something out there, get people's experience, see what they're kind of seeing in it, and just, use that to sort of reorientate your own understanding of your own work and how you can maybe see it in a different way. And I just think it's so incredibly helpful and fast and brilliant. And I'm not an expert at it, but I very much appreciate and understand, why it's brilliant for, everyone here, artists, collectors, and I it's something I want to try and understand better and do in a very kind of honest and me sort of way.
Yeah, I love it. And I think that as us collectors, we've talked about this with a few artists. I know there can feel like a lot of pressure that you always have to be available, but what we really pick up on the most is when people are being authentic. And I think that it seems like you're doing this really authentically in a thoughtful way, and that was expressed beautifully here on the Spaces. So I want to say thank you for sharing everything. I think we're going to wrap it up now, but we really appreciate everybody showing up. I mean, this is what the craziest stuff is about Web3 and Gen Art for me. I don't know how many people came on here. Let's say there's about 100 on here right now from all over the world, all sorts of backgrounds and interests. Even I know this from some of the folks that I personally know here. And so it's just such a cool space, such a cool time. And we really appreciate you being a part of this and sharing your beautiful work and your time with us here today.
Guys, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate you inviting me on to do, especially something in a new way, which is my favorite thing. So, Jared and P, you guys are legends, and I've loved so much of the podcasts you put out with, your perspectives on the market and your perspectives on art. It's exactly the kind of thing that I think as an artist, I don't often get to see, and you've really helped me kind of peel back, I think, a lot of that surface layer. So, thank you to you guys as well for doing this.
Thank you for coming on. We're truly honored that you would want to use this platform as an opportunity to showcase your project. So truly, truly humbled by your kind words. I'm somewhat blushing. You can't see me, but I do appreciate that. I know P does too. So thank you for sharing with the listenership. Thank you for being as open and vulnerable with your past and what got us to this point for Render's Game. For those who are not aware, which I can't imagine, but it will be available on Art Blocks. It will be a Dutch auction starting at 8 ETH. For anybody not familiar with a Dutch auction, it drops in certain time increments in price, and then there will be an eventual mint out, which would be called the mint out price. So, please feel free to engage with anybody here. We're all open. My DMs, P's DMs are open. We want to help in any way possible. Discuss through it. Please get familiar with the algorithm. Artblocks is a great platform that allows you to go through a lot of test outputs. So there's a lot going on here, and I'd be remiss if I didn't at least close this by saying, amazing project, great work. I'm constantly amazed by the quality of work that you continually put out. All of your projects are very beautiful. So thank you very much for allowing each and every one of us to see and the collectorship to partake in your journey. We're very, very honored.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Yup. And thanks again, MV. Everybody who's here listening, everybody who's going to listen later, everybody who tuned in and left, thank you for coming and listening to this amazing story about your work. Render's Game, Monday, February 13th, 1 p.m. Eastern, as Jared mentioned, the Dutch auction, and we will reach out to the allow list winner over the weekend. So thanks again, everybody. This will be recorded. We'll put it out on our podcast. You can listen to it on Twitter as well. And until next time, we will see you then.
Thank you for tuning into Collector's Corner. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen. If you like this episode and want to help us out, please subscribe and leave us a review on your podcasting platform of choice, like Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on YouTube. Please also follow us on Twitter for announcements as we expand to other social and content platforms. Our Twitter handle is @collectors_XYZ. We'd also love to hear any feedback you have, so please comment or reach out. We're always striving to be more useful and get better so we can help you in your collecting journey. The Collector's Corner team and their guests are not registered investment advisors. All views expressed on this podcast are personal opinions and are not specific inducements to make particular investments or investment strategies and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. This show is solely for informational and entertainment purposes only. Before making any financial decisions, please consult a professional.